Okay. I have clearly underestimated the time for my talk, so apologies. But I wanna finish on this because I think it's very. So I wanna finish on entanglement and non-separability because I think it's a subtlety that we have to look at more closely, especially if you are working with quantum systems where you have really more than one degree of freedom that is accessible to you. Okay, so like when we talk about ion traps, for example, these days, we're not only talking about ground and excited state, we're also talking about the vibrational modes. When we're talking about photons, there's a lot of degrees of freedom there. So we just have to be, I think, very, very careful and look at entanglement in the context of those accessible degrees of freedom as well. Okay, so who here has read the phrase classical entanglement? Classical entanglement, have you heard that? Yes? Okay, maybe you're more likely to encounter that phrase when you work with photons because there are some non-separability that you can actually show with just classical light fields. And that's what people would often refer to as classical entanglement. But I want to make a distinction between the two. And much of this comes from a really nice paper by Natalia Korolkova and Gerd Loix in Philosophical Transactions, just came out last year. I'm very grateful we have this paper now because it gives us a framework to talk about entanglement. So the entanglement that we have talked about earlier, you need statistical correlations between measurement outcomes. When I do a Bell experiment, Alice and Bob chooses between two measurements and we look at the outcomes of those measurements. So there are two measurement outcomes, two measurements, in addition to the Hilbert spaces that are really separate to begin with, because you've got one particle Hilbert space here and one particle Hilbert space here. Now, what has happened historically is that I think people forgot that it's not just the two Hilbert spaces that you need. You need to have the measurements, you need to have the statistical measurements of the outcomes, statistical correlations of the outcomes as well that are coming from those two measurements. So in this paper, they talk about the measurement and they talk about the Hilbert space. Because measurement is something physical that you do. However you partition the Hilbert space is mathematical, right? Like if I have, say, for example, 4 qubits, I can, okay, let's not do 4 qubits. So if for example, you have, a photon with different degrees of freedom, say, I want to use polarization and wavelength, say, okay? And I wanna use those two Hilbert spaces. I can like divide them into whatever experiment I want to do on those 2 degrees of freedom, mathematically and experimentally, right? So the Hilbert space is mathematical, the measurement is physical. So in this paper, they actually classified entanglement, not classified, but maybe just make a map of non-separability. And I leave you to decide what you want to define as entanglement. I'm just giving you this map, okay? Because often we hear entanglement is about non-separability. And what I'm saying is it's not just about the non-separability, it's about the measurements as well. Okay, so in this, sorry, I should have, okay. So in this diagram, oh, can I use my mouse now? Oh, great, okay. So in this diagram, we have the non-separable states. We've got this dark blue circle here, which are 2 objects. So 2 objects, I can do 2 measurements. This is your quintessential entangled pair, okay? But actually, your entangled pair can also be two coupled 1D harmonic oscillators, right? Mathematically, they will be the same. I can do two measurements. I can do measurement here, and I can get statistical outcomes, just like in a Bell photon pair. The next class is the what they call non-locality, because here you only have one photon. So this is one example of this 2A class here. I have here one photon. This is a beam splitter. The beam splitter is going to make the photon go either this way or this way. I can write that as entanglement of this path and this path, but there's only one photon, there's only one excitation. And they're sharing these two mode functions that was defined by the beam splitter, okay? So that's also non-separable, but that is a different kind of non-separable from this one. This one here are the ones where you can do, so this one, you can do two measurements, but there's only also one particle in a way, but this is different excitations in different directions, okay? So these are two measurements, so this is one harmonic oscillator, but now it's doing oscillation in 2 dimensions. So single particle undergoing 2 excitations. So in the outside, what you have are the non-separable, where you actually don't have two measurements, you only have the non-separable Hilbert spaces, okay? I should have brought that up. So this is just to show that what these states are. Okay, so non-separability, especially when you're working with photons, because a photon is an excitation, and you have different degrees of freedom that you can use as your qubit. But I think it's important to understand those mode functions are frames of excitation, right? If I have a photon where I'm controlling, say, both polarization and wavelength, when I measure the photon, both those degrees of freedom are gone. In a sense that I cannot measure the wavelength anymore because the photon's gone. Okay, there's only, so the mode functions, when you're talking about a photon, regardless of how many degrees of freedom you're using, when you do a projective measurement on the photon is gone. Okay, and I think it's important to remember that. So I can write, so in the paper, so you can write a non-separable state like this, where now we are more careful. 1 and 2 refer to degrees of freedom, and K and L refer to just mode functions on those degrees of freedom, okay? And you can, and this is what those non-classical entanglement experiments are about. You have a field, you can control these 2 degrees of freedom, and what you're looking at, what you're actually measuring is, you have your source, which is this state here, you're preparing in 2 degrees of freedom. You're passing it through some device, which let's call a filter. That filter sorts, and then you do a measurement. The measurement gets correlated with the filter setting here. Okay, it's very it's different from the correlations that you have when you have the actual 2-particle experiment, because here you're actually correlating a measurement here and a measurement here. Here you have a correlation between some filter setting and a measurement here. The difference is that this is a measurement, This is a measurement. This is not a measurement. This is a unitary process. If I go back, I get to the state that you have here, right? But when people write about classical entanglement, they treat it like it's entanglement. And I agree from the non-separability point of view, that's entanglement, but I think it's important to make the distinction between this process and this process here. Okay, so that's just the point of that paper. That when we talk about non-separability in entanglement, it has to be a decisive non-separability. That you actually make those two measurements and you're correlating the outcomes of those measurements. It's not something that, oh, I can choose to filter based on this, filter based on that, because this is not a measurement. That's a unitary process. And that's what a lot of papers that have, a state like that. So this is a photon with non-separable vector spaces. So this is the spatial mode, LG1, LG2, so those are spatial modes. Second degree of freedom is horizontal and vertical. So when they do entanglement measurements here, what you'll often do is you'll have a PBS that would separate, that will measure, but you're actually just separating horizontal and vertical. That's not a measurement. But you can show the non-separability in that way. Like, I have no issue with that. My issue is just, I think we just have to distinguish between those two kinds of non-separability, because one is actual quantum entanglement non-separability. The other one is like a mathematical non-separability that will never be able to show the existence or non-existence of realism, for example, or locality or non-locality. Yes.
Or is it that even if I had, let's say, only, so for instance, if I have like time-based coding, right, which is like one mistake, and somehow that I make entanglements, and like, do you count that as classical, or that's also like, is this because you mix these two modes and they're not the same?
So you can do this because experimentally you can like couple the spatial mode with polarization, or probably time bin as well. So there's a coupling that's happening, but that coupling in a way is deterministic, right? Like I can, I'm familiar with OA, with the spatial mode. So we have a Q plate, for example, we call it, and that's what we use to couple a particular OAM value to some polarization. So you can design devices like that, and that coupling is, so that correlation is like by design. It's different from the correlation that you have when you've got the entangled pairs, but they're definitely non-separable vector spaces as well. Yeah.
If I don't have this extra knowledge that you said, so if I don't know that this is like an actual filter that's like a unit sphere, I can go back and I only see the statistics of the experiments, then from the point of view of like in the level of the statistics, it's the same as the entanglement.
And that's what some papers have claimed, actually, that they're using a setup like this to comment on realism and non-locality and all the other things that the Bell inequality is commenting about. And to me, as an experimentalist and maybe sometimes philosopher as well, it doesn't make sense to me. So anyway, okay, my opinions, but similar to their opinions as well. So I'm glad that somebody wrote that paper, but yeah, yeah. Yes.
Curious question. Does it matter if the filtering process itself is deterministic or rapid?
I mean, the filtering. Well, the filtering process is, I designed the filter, so it's gonna be When you design a filter, you say mode A go here, mode B go here, right?
Would it change the conclusion if I say I pick like which path it goes randomly?
Okay, I can't imagine a device like that. I don't know how you do it. So it's like you're saying, what if the filtering operation is like a mixture of filtering? Is that?
Not quite sure, but suppose that the system will just pick it and it goes
So a measurement is non-unitary. So I think if you can maybe if you make the filtering non-unitary, I don't know how you do a filtering like that. Maybe it would. but I think about it, right? Like Bell comments about two separate objects in different, it's commenting about locality, right? In your photon, you've got your polarization and your wavelength or whatnot. Why are we talking about locality or non-locality? So anyway, okay, I will, yeah, I'll stop there. I can talk forever about this. Okay, so that's the end of my first talk. So I hope you got there was something for everyone, like I don't expect you to understand or enjoy everything, but I hope you learned something new. So I talked about qubits. So we know they're described by complex numbers, vectors, or matrices. The high dimensionality is a double-edged sword that you have to engineer around and really be creative to harvest the advantage of. Measuring a qubit resolves to one dit, same as measuring just a dit. But there are interesting communication tasks where a qubit gives you an advantage over dits. And these are the tasks where you're not trying to minimize error, but you're trying to beat an enemy. I'm going to give you an example in my next talk. Entanglement is a superposition of superpositions. And high dimensional entanglement, like I've shown you some results where you can really see differentiation between entanglement and non-locality. I've introduced CGLNP inequality, which gives you more robust violations for non-locality as well. And finally, we looked at just non-separability and entanglement, because I think that's an important subtlety to keep in mind when you're doing your experiments. Okay? That's the end of the first talk. I'm gonna go to the second one now, which is a generic experiments on photonic qubits. Let me find, where's my talk? Okay. Yes, okay. Okay, so the first talk, I hope, like set the scene for what are the objects that we are dealing with when we're doing qubit quantum information. This talk, I want to show you some experiments and actually how we translate those measurements and inequalities into actual experiments. So it's going to be a talk on experiments. So my plan is to just review photonic qubits. I'm going to focus on transverse mode or shape because that's my specialty. I'm going to talk to you in detail about two experiments that we did. One is on ignorance. I hope I will convince you that ignorance of the whole does not imply ignorance of the parts. Then I'm going to show you quantum state tomography in higher dimensions. If you do quantum state tomography, really try self-guided tomography. It's amazing. And then I'm going to talk about some high dimensional gates. And then I'm going to review some photonic entanglement experiments. Going through all of that, let me just, we'll see how we go. I'm still here tomorrow. I have 4-hour slots with you, a 4-hour slot with you tomorrow. So we will not hurry. Okay. I want to show you a calculation that Gerard Milburn, like you've heard about him yesterday, like he wrote the quantum technology book when it wasn't fashionable in the 1980s. Why do we use photons? Why do photons maintain coherence in room temperature? Why are they quantum in room temperature? And he said to me, because the world is cold at optical frequencies. And if you just look at the back of the envelope calculation, indeed the world is cold for photons. And what I mean by that is if I just plug in, does it display? Yeah, okay. Omega is your optical frequency. I plug that into the black body equation, and what you'll actually find is that the average number of background thermal photons is almost nothing. So quantum effects will manifest at room temperature. I don't need millikelvin to we don't need millikelvin to make it really cold for the photons because it's already, room temperature is already cold. Okay, so quantum manifests with photons at room temperature. I've already shown you earlier the photonic qubits, so we use polarization, wavelength, frequency, time bin, and transverse mode or shape. In the literature, it's also called orbital angular momentum. It's also called twisted light, structured light, like there are many names, but really just what we mean is that you solve your wave equation, look at the families of the solution, and use that as your qubit. Okay, so for transverse modes, so of course, entanglement of polarization has been around since the 1980s. For transverse modes, it started with, there's a theory paper from Steve Barnett and Sonia Franke Arnold in 2000. Yeah, I think around the same time this experimental paper came out, but it was early 2000s. So for shape, you want to show entanglement because that's your quintessential quantum correlation. How do you demonstrate that? You need a source of your entangled qubits. You need a source of photons that are entangled in their orbital angular momentum. And that is what this experiment was. This is actually from Zeilinger's group back in 2001. So what they have is a nonlinear crystal that they're pumping with an ultraviolet photon. With some probability, the photon gets converted to two lower energy photons that you can then measure entangled properties of. Like in this case, they measured orbital angular momentum. So they showed correlation between the OAM of this one and OAM of this one. Like when I say OAM, do you know? Are you familiar with OAM? Think of Laguerre-Gaussian modes as your solution to the wave equation. There are two indices there, L and P. L can be it's an integer, so it's negative or positive or zero. When you have a process like this, the L values have to sum to whatever is the L value of the pump. Okay, so that's what this experiment was. When I think about it, actually, by today's standards, the entanglement that they showed there probably will be, we will get rejected outright. Like they didn't measure fidelity, there's no density matrix, there's nothing like that. What they showed was just plots. It's almost like an intensity plot, really. But they showed counts, just counts that are different for a mixture or or entangled state. So yeah, if you want some history, read that paper. I read that paper as an undergraduate student, and I found it fascinating. And look, I'm still here. Cannot escape. Okay, so this experiment is interesting because maybe you haven't seen this before. Like those are what's called holograms. Usually when we talk about Bell experiments, we use polarizers. That's what we use to measure the 2D state of the polarization. Because spatial modes have a lot of possible states, you use holograms that you manufacture one hologram for one state, okay? So they have lots of holograms for the different states that they are measuring. The genius of that paper, to me, is this. We have been generating different transverse modes forever, right? Like, since when did Gabor invent the hologram? That was 1960s, 1970s, right? You can make any shape that you like with a hologram. It's one device that you use for generation of a particular state. What Zeilinger's paper realized in 2001 is that what you can use to generate, you can also use to measure, right? Like, when you say it like that, oh, it's so obvious. But it's actually, 2001 when they did this experiment. So what do I mean by that? When you want to generate a donut shape like that, you shine a Gaussian, like a nice Gaussian beam to a hologram, and then this one is a diffraction grating. It's got different orders, but in the first order direction, you're gonna find a mode like that, okay? But luckily, because optics also works backwards, what you can infer when you have a photon here, so say this is a single mode fiber connected to a single photon detector, okay? Single photon detector clicks. This single mode fiber, therefore, has a photon. The photon that gets coupled to the fiber are only photons that are of this particular shape. So I can infer that the photon that impinged on this hologram must be this particular shape, because that's the only one that will get converted back to this mode here. So it's exactly the reverse of this one, right? Same thing as a polarizer, right? If I put a horizontal polarizer in front of a single photon detector and it clicks, I will infer that a horizontal photon has passed through the horizontal polarizer, because that's the only mode that will pass through that polarizer, okay? So think of these holograms as a polarizer, but for many different possibilities of transverse modes, or OAM, or structured light. But the key thing is you have one hologram for one mode, same as one polarizer for one polarization. So in that 2001 experiment, like you'd be thinking now maybe, well, if there are a lot of possible states, do I have to make a lot of holograms as well? Because obviously you want to measure superpositions of these states, right? You have to create a hologram for each of those states. Luckily, we have a device called a spatial light modulator, and this is really what I did my PhD on. I changed the hologram, the fixed hologram that was in Zeilinger's experiment, to a spatial light modulator. And that opened up a wealth of states that you can measure, because now you can program this hologram into literally anything that you like. And that's important because when you want to measure qubits, there are a lot of possibilities. And also, as I would, this is an experiment I'm going to show you earlier, not only for measurement, but also for transforming one qubit to another. You need these spatial light modulators as well. Okay, so that's just some examples of qubits in transverse modes. So you can represent your qubits using spatial modes. I just use 2 orthogonal modes. That's your dead and alive cat. I can choose more, so I can just choose more orthogonal states. That's my Q-quart, for example, okay? So you can prepare and measure those states. Okay, So now I'm gonna tell you about this. I call it one of my babies because this really is a project that I started in 2011, I think, but did not publish until 2020 because I was a PhD student and I saw the theory paper. The title of the paper is this: Does ignorance of the whole imply ignorance of the parts? And that PRL paper is actually Vidic and Benner in 2011, had a cartoon like this. And I thought it was interesting, a PRL has a cartoon. But also, if you think about it, when you have entangled state, you have perfect knowledge of the whole, and you've got ignorance of the parts. So this paper is kind of approaching it like from the other direction. Like, I don't know, maybe to the philosophers that would be attractive. But anyway, so I thought that was an interesting paper. I want to show that in an experiment. So this is a work that I did. So 2011, I was in Glasgow. I haven't finished my PhD yet. I have to finish the PhD. So that project was shelved until I went to Australia and I had PhD student Michael. Sally is a philosopher and Andrew White is Bill knows Andrew. He is the caretaker of the pitch drop experiment. Among his many roles, he's the caretaker of the pitch drop experiment. Okay, and then so I finally did the experiment, and I really love this research, this experiment. The reviewer didn't like it, we often don't show reviews of our papers. I'm gonna show you a bad review. Remember that next time you get rejected, it's okay. But then we persisted, so we answered all the questions, and the referee actually said something nice finally. But like they said that it's a nice real-world interpretation of a very, I don't know, maybe even obscure inequality that came from very abstract world of quantum foundations and computer science. So I want to test that actually, that this is accessible to non-experts. And you're expert, so you have no excuse, okay? So that paper is this one. My family knows how much I love it. They gave me a mug with this one printed on it. Okay, so this is that's this work here. And I want you to remember the communication tasks that I was talking about earlier. Because when I was reading that paper on communication tasks, I was actually thinking of how I could reframe this in terms of a communication task, in terms of a communication matrix, and then show that the optimal implementation is what we did in this experiment. Like, maybe that's another paper, like a reflection of on an experiment. Okay, so first thing, we have whole and parts. Often when we talk about wholes and parts, we think of an entangled pair because that's naturally whole, part one, part two. I tried to do this experiment with entangled pairs in Glasgow. It was hard. That's why actually I shelved it, because I have to graduate the PhD first before I do difficult and fun things. When I went to Australia, working with Sally and Michael and Andrew, we actually realized that why don't we just use a dit string? A dit string with 2 dits, and one part is the first string, the second part is the second, the first dit is the first part, second dit is the second part. So it's just a dit string. And really the only intuition that you need is that randomness will increase as the dimension increases. Okay? Who remembers min entropy from Arthur's talk? You remember he mentioned min entropy? Yes. So this is an experiment about min entropies. Because the way that Vinnick and Venner posed the inequality was in terms of min entropies. So let's review min entropy first. So when you have an encoding E and yours, okay. So this is the conditional probability. So conditional probability of successfully guessing Y given that your encoding strategy is E, okay? So we're talking about like the encoding strategies that I was talking about earlier, like Alice sends either 0 or 1 or some prepared state that's SIC POVM, that's like the basis states of a SIC POVM. So encoding is just a preparation of some state, okay? Now min entropy, as Arthur has defined it, as this paper has defined it, is this. It's the negative log of the guessing probability. Negative log of the conditional probability that you guess Y given E, okay? The min entropy is large when the guessing probability is small, okay? That's all you need to know about min entropy, okay? So min entropy is large when ignorance is large because you can't guess, okay? So this is the inequality in that paper. For any random variable y0, y1, this is our dit string, and encoding E, there exists a random variable C, which is just a pointer. So this is like which part of the string, okay? So C is which part. There exists a random variable such that this inequality holds. So left-hand side is the min entropy of a part. The right-hand side is min entropy of the whole, okay? Like if you want to, in an English translation, this is sort of how I translate that. The ignorance of the part is at least half of the ignorance of the whole, right? Makes sense. So the way that we did the experiment and sort of like the way that the paper introduced it as well was in terms of a game. So there's a game with a student who's being examined like there's an evil teacher just asking the student, what is Y0? What is Y1? Okay? But the student can bring an encoding with them, like a cheat sheet. Encoding can be anything that they like. Okay, so given this encoding and the teacher asks for some part C, what would be the min entropies and can we violate this min entropy? Okay, so there exists, so the inequality says there exists a pointer such that it can point to the part that the student doesn't know. Okay, so you can identify in a classical information scenario, you can identify which part the student doesn't know. There's always a test that reveals the unknown part for the student, okay? So the teacher's task is to find which part the student doesn't know in that dit string. So we put this in terms of a probability just so it's easier. So this is again the dit string. You have Y0, Y1. You've got your D possibility. So we'll do experiments shot by shot. There's one shot is this Y0, Y1. There are D possibilities for each of Y0 and Y1. And then you've got an encoding, a preparation for the student that they can use. And then the teacher asks. So the cheat sheet is a preparation. The teacher asks is a measurement, okay? And then from there, we can calculate the guessing. So we can get the probability for guessing given that this is the encoding that the student has, okay? So there exists a pointer such that I recast this now in terms of a probability rather than min entropy, but it's the same inequality. So the inequality is this. The probability of guessing a part C given an encoding E and that the teacher asked for part C is gonna be, it's gonna be bounded by 1 over square root of D. Okay, it's the same inequality, just now in terms of probabilities rather than mean entropies. Okay, so let's look at an example actually. How does the teacher spot an ignorance for that dit string? Okay, so the optimal classical strategy for the student would be, okay, I have a preparation that I can do. I'm gonna encode one part. I'm gonna put Y1. Okay, so I always know Y1. The student always knows Y1. So when the teacher asks for what is Y1, I know Y1. The probability of guessing will be 1. But if the teacher asks for the other part that the student did not encode, they will have to guess that randomly, 1 over D, right? So you've got the best guessing probability, which is when the encoding is the same as what the teacher asked, and a worst probability, which is you just guess at random, okay? So for the teacher to find which part of the string the student doesn't know, they just have to do the experiment over and over and find which of these two strings is the student guessing randomly, okay? And you can check that the inequality holds because 1 over D is less than 1 over square root of D. Okay, is that clear? Okay, now what can be a quantum encoding? So now you're allowed to use a QDIT, and the quantum strategy is to encode something like this. Okay, so this is also given in the paper. So you encode states like this. X and Z are just your X and Z in higher dimensions, and your Y0 and Y1 are powers to those matrices. Okay, so we prepare those states. That's the QDIT encoding for a 2-dit string. I will not write the exact state like in terms of the basis states that we use, but that's what it is. Okay, so experimentally, I need a preparation and a measurement. Preparation for the encoding for the student, and a measurement for like the teacher asking the student about the dit string, right? So I have here, what we actually used was an attenuated laser, attenuated such that there's only one photon most of the time through the experiment. And we also have a single photon detector, okay? And then we have spatial light modulator to prepare the QDIT encoding. We put like, if you've used SLMs before, like, you know, they're polarization sensitive, like they only want one polarization. So you have to be careful about the polarization. That's what these waveplates are for. Okay, so after this, we prepare the encoding, and then this is the measurement. It's another SLM. This is like the teacher in that paper. Okay, so encoding and then the measurement. And then we have the encoding, we have a measurement. If I were to turn the laser stronger so I can see the states that we are preparing, these are the dit strings. Okay, they look really pretty. Okay, but also you can see that we are actually able to prepare the states very, very well. Like look at that, right? They're really very well. And we went up to, I think in the experiment, they went up to 14 dimensions. Okay? So we can do these preparations and measurements, and then we'll do the trace, which is just this. And we do the experiment, we use lots of photons, we can calculate these probabilities. And you see what happens when you're using this encoding is that the probability of guessing Y0 is this. The probability of guessing Y1, given that encoding, is this. So you see the probability of guessing is the same for both parts, right? Neither of the parts are being guessed randomly, so the teacher will not be able to recognize which one is the unknown part, okay? And if you test that against the inequality, you actually see that indeed you will violate that inequality with this quantum encoding here. Okay? So if the quantum encoding is used, there is no pointer C. The teacher cannot find the unknown part because the guessing probabilities are the same. Okay? Another way of looking at it is in terms of a game, and this is very closely related, I think, to all these CHSH games. So classical optimal strategy, we saw that earlier. You prepare just one of the DITs. When you take the average success probability there, you've got 75%. When you look at the quantum strategy, the average success probability now becomes 85%. You can calculate that for different dimensions. You can see it separates a bit more when you go to higher dimensions. Okay? So in the experiment, we tried different dimensions. This is one run for D equals 13, I think. Okay, so here Q refers to the choice of the teacher. So if the teacher always asks Y1, so the encoding is, let's just show it, I'll just show everything. Okay, so if the teacher always asks Y1, but the student encodes Y0, then the student will not be able to guess, right? Same as on the other side here. And here you have the quantum encoding where you have, regardless of the probability that the teacher asks which part, the guessing probability is uniform. So the teacher cannot point to which part of the string the student doesn't know. Okay? So this experiment, of course, is like you do lots of shots. The teacher has some probability of asking 1 or 2, and you build that statistics to get a plot like this. Okay? So with the 1 qubit encoding of the 2-dit string, the student can get a higher score in that exam, and the teacher cannot point to the part that the student doesn't know because the guessing probability becomes uniform. We actually tried to do it for different dimensions. So you can see violation here up to D equals 14. And we tried also with some like qubits. I think we tried with some leaking bits as well. But yeah, if you want to know more, read that paper. Okay, who here works with single photons and just uses an attenuated laser instead of heralded or quantum dot or whatever fancy single photon source you have? Okay, so another thing that we encountered in submitting this, I'm gonna show you the secrets now. That one referee was very adamant that we did not use a single photon source, that we actually just use an attenuated laser. And we fought that very hard. I think it was like 2 rounds of arguments with the reviewer. Okay, so they were asking us, why are you not using a single photon source like a heralded SPDC? And the short answer is that we don't need one because we are looking at single photon probabilities. And if you look at heralded SPDC, it's thermal in theory but Poissonian in practice. Like there's actually a paper back in 2009 which says that. The other thing is that this is from 1996 proceedings. The quantum regime is attained for classical coherent light fields because their point was that it's a coherent light field because you're just attenuating. But what this is saying is that even for classical coherent light, if you only have 1 photon in your interferometer and you're detecting 1 photon, I won't argue with that. Okay, so we showed them those two papers, and then they were happy. They let us use just an attenuated laser. If you're curious about more of the subtleties, actually, there's a nice paper from Steve Barnett on single photon and classical interference. So this is when will you use when will you use a strong laser, an attenuated laser, a single photon? So that's a really nice paper from Steve. Okay, and then the other question that was asked was, I mean, what is quantum about this work? I don't know really. So I think that this encoding is quantum. Like you cannot do that for a DIT. Like this encoding, that's something you can do only with qubits. And also, I will take a page from from Rodney Loudon's book. I detected single photons here. So depends on your level of I don't know, threshold for quantum. Anyway, okay. I think it's about the encoding and decoding that you do. Okay. So that's my bit about ignorance. Now I want to talk about knowledge instead. Like when I say knowledge, it's really dramatic, but it's just quantum state tomography, really. Okay, so I want to talk about quantum state tomography because that's something that's also maybe harder for qubits. So this work is work that I did with Marcus, Michael, like all these people. You might recognize Chris Ferry. Do you know Chris Ferry, Quantum Physics for Babies? He actually writes science papers as well. Although he's got a lot of books now, but he's a good friend and legit physicist. Okay, so this is robust and efficient high-dimensional quantum state tomography. That's the paper there. So I want to introduce quantum state tomography. Quantum state tomography answers the question, what is the quantum mechanical description of a physical system? So as you know, the parameter space grows as 4 to the n minus 1 for n qubits. That's just how many elements your density matrix will have. So I was actually, because I'm working with Chris and I know Chris can explain things well, I asked him, why do you always use qubits instead of qubits? And he actually told me the same thing you were saying earlier, because any D can be represented by any n qubits. I don't think that's true because you have odd D as well. But okay, so the parameter space increases as dimension increases. It's actually D to the 2n minus 1 for n qubits. So we want to do quantum state tomography as efficiently as we can. So quantum state tomography is about finding a density matrix rho, given that you have some data that is generated by some true state in your experiment. Okay, so the data set needs to be saved, of course, and you have to process that complete set of measurements. It's often maximum likelihood that we use. We try to find the most likely density matrix that will explain the results of our experiments. Okay, that's maximum likelihood. So it can be computationally expensive. It comes after post-processing. It's sensitive to noise because it uses probabilities. The method that we use is no post-processing, for pure states at least, no post-processing. It's efficient and it's robust. And this is the self-guided tomography, which is a paper from Chris from 2014. Okay, so we saw this paper and we thought, because I can do prepare and measure in my experiment very easily, I can do self-guided tomography easily as well. So self-guided tomography is about exploring this high-dimensional space in some sophisticated gradient descent manner. Okay, so you start with an unknown target state. So there's an unknown target state. You have an estimate of what the state is. Okay, and from that estimate, you choose two measurement directions. So you just choose essentially two projective measurements in these directions here. So measure those two states, and then feed that into this gradient equation here. Now, I have to say the gradient has some hyperparameters that we tuned. So before we even began doing the experiment, we were simulating lots of states and lots of hyperparameters, and then we use the hyperparameters that led us to the state most quickly. Okay, so there's some tuning for the hyperparameters. You can count that as a cost too, but it's a cheap cost. Okay, so after the result of those two projections, you calculate the gradient, and then you calculate the gradient based on this distance measure here. So the distance measure that we use, because we were using pure states for this first demonstration, we just use the fidelity, and that's easy. You can use anything really for as long as it's experimentally accessible to you. For as long as, so it doesn't have to be fidelity is what I'm saying. Fidelity was just easy for us. Okay, so we have this self-guided tomography, and then from the gradient where we've put in this F, we calculate the next update of the state, and then we do everything again. Okay, so we have, again, here you have hyperparameters that we have optimized. Okay, so I call it sophisticated gradient descent tomography. So we prepared different QDIT states, so just single QDITs for different dimensions. So this is what we use, for example, for a Q-trit. That's a Q-quint for 5 dimensions. I'm not going to show you, we did up to 20. This is what the state looks like. This is what the mask looks like. Isn't it quite pretty? Okay. And then the experiment looks very much like the experiment I have for my ignorance experiment, because it's a prepare and measure experiment. So we calculate the fidelity from the counts that we get. So note that I am not using probabilities here. I am just using counts, because really the overlap, if these, so say, think of polarizers, right? If you have horizontal preparation, what will maximize the counts here will be a horizontal detection, right? So it's like you are, if it were polarization, what you'll do is you'll just randomly rotate until you get the maximum count, right? So that's what's happening here. We are going through different preparation and measurements that will maximize the counts in the experiment. Okay, so in that way as well, because we're not using probabilities, we're not sensitive to what I would call like mode-dependent efficiencies, because sometimes when you're measuring in higher dimensions, you find you can actually measure 0 much better than you can say measure 5. And that will be a problem if you're using probabilities, if you don't know what those characteristic efficiencies are. So for this kind of experiment, we didn't need to know that. So that was good. Okay, so we did lots and lots of preparations and measurements of QDITs. So that's our simulations for 1,000 Q-trit and Q-quint states. That's the experiment. As you see, it's very nice. The y-axis is infidelity, which is 1 minus fidelity. So that's how low we can go. We can get 99.92% fidelity, which is really great. And what's better is that you see this one just keeps on going down. So if you just iterate more and more, you will have lower fidelity. Our 20-dimensional state was still good, but it wasn't as high. It was 99.1. Yeah, which is still, I think, very good. Okay, and then the next thing we did was we check how does it work if we have less photons? Because as you know, if you have less photons, you have higher statistical noise, and often maximum likelihood doesn't like that, because you're gonna mess up the probabilities when you have less counts. So in our case, we did, for high statistical noise, we were just measuring 80 photons for Q-trits and about 1,000 photons for D equals 5, and we still get really good fidelities. Okay, so we can get the quantum state with 80 counts of photons. The other thing that we did was we simulated atmospheric turbulence, because often these spatial modes are used for QKD. So you are going to go through turbulence at some point. So we simulated it. And here you can see that even with that simulated turbulence, we're still getting to high fidelities, like 98% and 97% here, 95% for D equals 20. So we were very happy. Yeah. Okay. And then we compare that with standard tomography. So the infidelity that we get, when I say standard, it's maximum likelihood. So we do that, and you see self-guided works very well here. It has lower infidelity for all three cases. This one is for when you have higher noise with some noise. So as you can see, self-guided tomography does better compared to the maximum likelihood. And then we submitted that paper. We submitted that paper, and then we had, I don't have the review here, we did more characterization with comparing maximum likelihood and standard tomography. And what you find actually is that the infidelity for standard tomography would stagnate. It doesn't have, there's nothing you can do anymore. Above some fidelity, you can't do anything anymore. Whereas the self-guided tomography always just keeps going down like that, okay? If you increase the iteration, you always decrease the infidelity. And then when we submitted it, because we did only pure states, the referee asked, okay, that's all good, but how about mixed states? And mind you, that was before Christmas when we got that review. But I said to the postdoc and student, let's just do one more push. Let's do a mixed state self-guided tomography. So we did that for acute RIT. So we tried different mixed states of this form. The change is that instead of estimating 3 parameters, because that's what you have when you have acute RIT, that's a pure state, you now have 9 elements of your matrix. So it's a bit it will take longer. And also we had to change the fidelity to the quantum relative entropy. Like you have to ask Chris Ferry why he thought the quantum relative entropy is what we will use. But we did that, we changed fidelity to this, and then we again saw that behavior where you can achieve high fidelity. So this is 96.5 for mixed Q-trit states. And you have this linear in a log-log plot as well, which tells you that the infidelity will just go smaller as you increase the iterations. And it was also robust. We had to use more photons, of course, because it's a mixed state, but even with like 800 counts, we can estimate the mixed state really well. Okay, and I showed this paper in, I think, UCMC in 2022. If you want to do self-guided tomography, we're happy to share code. Luckily, in that conference was Christina Paderborn's group, Christine Silverhorn's group in Paderborn, and they have really good frequency modes. So we do spatial modes, transverse spatial modes, they do frequency modes. They have a device called MQPG, which is a POVM for frequency modes. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. So they did this self-guided tomography with frequency QDITs, and they got like really nice results as well, comparable to what we got. And like the improvement actually increases as you increase the dimensionality as well. So we were happy about that. I think it came out just this year. So yeah, check it out if you're interested in frequency modes as well. Okay. So now that's my two things I want to show you in detail. The rest, I have time, I think. Maybe let's take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, I'm going to show you how to do QDIT gates And I'm gonna review some photonic entanglement experiments in high dimensions. Okay? Okay. Okay, last two items for tonight. So this next part, I want to show you how you can use a spatial light modulator, not just for measuring and preparing, but also for actually doing the transformations on your spatial mode qubits. Okay? Because for a long time, really, for free space spatial mode qubits, we know how to generate them, we know how to measure them, but we don't know how to transform, how do you do an X gate, a Z gate, and so on. So for that, we use what is called multiplane light conversion. So we collaborated with engineers at UQ, so Joel and Daniel are in the electrical engineering department. They are really good with multiplane light conversion. So I said to them, I want to have these operations, okay? I want to have an X and a Z in some dimension D. So for a qubit, this is just going to be a bit flip, right? But for higher dimensions, of course, we have to write them as a function of D. For D equals 3, that's what they look like. Okay, so we just generalize really to higher dimensions. And there have been proposals for spatial modes how to do that. This is an X gate, for example. This is the y-axis is the number of elements like this that you need for an X gate in this dimension here. Okay, so obviously I don't want to do that, because that is a lot of these OAM beam splitters. And look at that, they have Dove prisms inside. Like, have you ever worked with a Dove prism? Who has worked with a Dove prism? Okay, if you ever encounter Dove prism, they are evil to polarization. Okay, if you rotate a Dove prism, you'd think you're just changing the spatial mode. No, you're not. You're also changing the polarization. So just be careful. Okay, so I don't want to do that. I don't want to work with Dove prisms as much as possible. I want to use spatial light modulators. So the good thing about having those matrices is that, given I have fixed my basis, so I just show you an example for a 5D here. I've fixed it. I know what the X output will be. I know what the DFT output will be. I know what the Z output will be, right? Because I will just operate the matrix on my vectors and I get the output modes. The problem is, how do you design a device that gets you to these outputs here, okay? And that's where the multiplane light converter comes in, because the solution is this. The spatial light modulator can be divided into many sections. Each of them displays a particular pattern, okay? You're gonna ask me, maybe, why did you divide it into 7 sections? Is that 7? I think we use 7. Yes, okay? And I'm gonna have a very profound answer. It just works. Okay? We tried with different number of masks. We had some, I guess, cost-benefit analysis, like the bigger, the higher number of masks, the longer time you spend calculating what the masks are, because each one will be a bounce of the spatial light modulator and the mirror. Okay, but the good thing about it is that, again, it is a spatial light modulator. Optics works forwards and backwards the same way. So what's happening really is you're actually just matching the forward and backward, and then, you know, fixing the phase such that the forward matches the backward fields. It's actually in this article here from 2007 that I guess we just rediscovered recently. And that was the key for these transformations. So in this experiment, we just want to show that the MPLC works as promised, that if I want to do an X gate on 5 dimensions, I actually get the output of the X gate for 5 dimensions, okay? So this is the experiment. We have something that prepares the state. So these are all, of course, like bright, strong lasers, but we will measure eventually in single photon level. So we prepare with, we use an MPLC for preparing a state. Oh, this is recorded, right? Okay, so we actually haven't published this. Okay. So the spatial light modulator is actually inside this. Like we have a custom optic set up where we, I guess, strip the spatial light modulator that you buy from HoloEye or whoever is your favorite, Hamamatsu, because we are in Japan. We take just the SLM, and then we put a mirror on top, so mirror across from it so that the light just bounces off. It's a fixed distance between the spatial light modulator and the mirror. And then we have like custom optics for the polarization as well on both ends. Like it's all inside this. Okay, but the important thing is that in this device, you have 7 bounces of a spatial light modulator with patterns that you have pre-calculated to give you XZ DFT. Okay, and then we look at the output. So the output actually, in order to characterize it, we did something called digital holography, where you could actually get the amplitude of a field. You can get both intensity and phase as a function of XY, digital holography. So we can compare the output after the gate to what we theoretically expect if the X and Z and DFT were doing what was promised. Okay? So the MPLC was calculated, we calculated these masks. They actually turned out to be, there's some kind of symmetry that we're trying to understand. But those are the masks. It takes a while to calculate them, but the good thing about it is you fix your dimension, you fix your operation, and then that's it. So we put that in the MPLC in that experiment that I showed you, and these are the results for X. The student was very ambitious. I said I'll be happy with 5 because I just want to show high dimensional gates. But it turns out Robert Fickler from Vienna already showed, oh, not Vienna, sorry, he is in Finland these days, showed D equals 5. So we can't do D equals 5 anymore. We have to aim higher. So we got up to 17 dimensions for an X, a Fourier transform, and a Z. And if you can see the nice, fields around, so this is the expected, the one in the inner circle, and then the outer ones is the digital holography from the experiment. Okay, so as you can see, they're actually quite nice. Okay, and then of course they're engineers, so they gave us these quantities as well. So insertion loss is very bad. Okay, like it's 88% loss. So we are thinking of how can we make it more efficient, which probably would have to give up programmability, but it's a problem for another day. Okay, but the important take home is that you can make QDIT gates. We can design QDIT gates with MPLC. Okay, so in the last few slides, I want to show you some entanglement experiments with photons, and I'm going to start with the I'm going to start with the Aspey-Clauser experiment. We don't often say it, but the entangled photon source that we use now for quantum internet or QKD, whatnot, those are very different from what Alan and John Clauser used in the 70s and 80s. They actually use the atomic cascade in calcium. Okay, so imagine an atom gets excited to this higher level state, and then with some probability will emit 2 photons as it goes back down this ground state. Okay, I cannot imagine how difficult this experiment is because one, I cannot tell the photons from the atom where to go, right? It's gonna be emitted in all directions. Okay, and you can put your detector in a limited area. So that's one of the challenges that they had to overcome. I think this is Andrew's picture of the polarizers that, like the polarization measurement that Aspe used for his 1982 paper. Like, as you can see, they're very big. These are the very good timing polarization experiments. So as you can see, they're very big and probably not very efficient as well. This paper doesn't get cited often, and I feel sorry for them, but I think this is a very important development. When people realize that you can actually get entangled photons from a nonlinear optical process called spontaneous parametric down conversion, which those days were called optical parametric down conversion, but it's SPDC, and that's by Yanua Shi and Ali. So here they showed, so this is, don't you just wish that we can draw experiment figures like this? Now you go Blender or whatever, like, oh, I wish we can go back to these times. Anyway, I digress. Okay, so in this experiment, they have a crystal, a KDP crystal, which they're pumping, and then you have their measurements here. And the nice thing about it is that the direction that the photons go to after the crystal are defined by phase matching. So you can actually put your detectors where you think the photons will be. And I think that is an important development that we should mention more often. Okay? So these days, when we talk about entangled photons, we use SPDC and spontaneous 4-wave mixing, which are nonlinear optical processes. Okay, who knows what this kind of polarization means? Physics people would know this, but maybe not everyone. Okay, so when you have a material and it's subjected to an electric field, there is some degree of polarization, as in the charges separate. Okay, and that polarization can be described by this equation here. What we call nonlinear optics is when you have coefficients that are beyond this one here. Okay, so nonlinear optics, we talk about the chi2 and chi3 coefficients. SPDC and spontaneous 4-wave mixing have chi2 and chi3 nonlinearities. Okay, so from this nonlinear process, you can get photons that are entangled because of the conservation of transverse momentum and energy. So you have frequency entanglement, transverse mode entanglement, polarization entanglement from those conservations here. Okay, so you have a pump. For SPDC, you have a pump, and then that leads to 2 lower energy photons, signal and idler. For spontaneous 4-wave mixing, you have 2 pump photons and then signal and idler. Okay? Probably to a theorist, it doesn't. Yes?
The E's are missing the powers on the.
Over the?
And in the expansion, like the nonlinear.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
chi2, E squared, E.
Yes.
We don't know.
Yes, sorry, I missed the exponents. Yes. There is an exponent on the E's. Thank you. I'll change the slide. Okay. So when we talk about entangled photons now, they come from those nonlinear processes. This experiment is a CGLMP violation, the original version of the CGLMP. in 11, I think they did here up to 14 dimensions. You have to check out the paper. So this is by our colleague Tumisi. I was also in Glasgow around this time, but probably busy with something else, so I didn't get the nature physics paper. Okay, so the same Bell violations you can also do in these higher dimensions. You just choose to measure within 2D subspaces, okay? So this is a polarization, sinusoidal correlation from the Clauser experiment. You can do the same with the OAM transverse modes. In that experiment with the CGLMP, all you have to do is, the entangled state is given by this. That just comes from conservation of OAM. Okay, so that's like a 5 plus I plus state. And then CGLMP gives you a recipe for the measurements that you have to do. Okay? We have to translate those measurements into actual physical things that we can measure, that we can design. And those physical things are masks that are represented by these states here. So we make a mask that generates or measures a state like this, okay? And we write it in terms of the OAM value L here, okay? And then once you have that mask, all you do is you rotate it in the same way that you have your polarizers. You rotate the polarizers, okay? So this is all in that paper, how we translated those measurements. And the experiment is simple. You have the down-converted photons coming from SPDC here. We separate them, and then in both arms, we have a spatial light modulator, which is displaying the mask that will measure those optimal states for the CGLMP. Okay, and then again, when you have a photon that's of this particular shape, it will get coupled to the fiber, single photon detector will click. You get your coincidences, the correlations. And this is what the correlations look like, the coincidences. They're not sinusoidal anymore. They actually look a bit boring. There are some wiggles here. They're not very obvious, but that's for an 11 dimension CGLMP, okay? And then from there, you can calculate the CGLMP-S parameter, and they've done that up to 14 dimensions, but I think 14 doesn't violate the classical bound anymore, okay? So I think this is the highest, still the highest CGLMP inequality violation. In all, I want to say in all QDIT platforms. I know that Martin Ringbauer maybe is trying to do it with trap ions, but I don't think they got to 13. Okay, so just another subtlety, the other thing you have to think about when you're doing these experiments in SPDC is that ideally, when you write a state like this, ideally you want that to be a maximally entangled state, like it's the same probability of generating L here and minus L here. But in practice, that's not going to be the case. Actually, if you just look at the counts for different L values in that experiment, it's going to look like this. There is a higher probability of generating photons that are entangled in lower valued L. Okay, so how do they do the experiment in the face of this? You have to do some post-processing. It's called, they describe the filtering that they did, but in simple terms, it's really just introducing loss, artificial loss, so that in practice, you get a maximally entangled state. You introduce more loss to states that you generate well, so that you get this effectively equal generated state. You can solve that physically without any of these software tricks by engineering phase matching. Okay. Oops, is that time? Okay, so that's CGLMP inequality for 11 dimensions in the lab. This is CGLMP inequality also in the lab, but it's over 1 kilometer of fiber. So I think it's a bit of an upgrade. This is Qtrit going through 1 kilometer of fiber. This is collaboration with Guangcan Guo's group. This is the state that's the maximally entangled state that's being prepared. Obviously, the violation will be much less because there's 1 kilometer of fiber. As you can see, we only violate to 3 standard deviations, which is low in terms of current Bell violations. But we did quantum state tomography of the entangled state as well after the fiber, and we get 71% fidelity, which is not great, but it's also not too bad. Okay, so those are the experiments I've shown you so far are 2 QDITs. You can go wild like them and do more than 2 photons and more than 2 dimensions. Okay, so this is a paper from Anton Zeilinger's group where they did multi-photon, multi-dimensional entanglement. This is the state that they are trying to generate. So that's A has 3 possible values, B has 3 possible values, C has 2 possible values. So that's 3 by 3 by 2 entanglement. Okay? And the way they did the experiment, I will not describe in detail, but they needed 2 nonlinear crystals. They combine the photons. So 3 of the photons, they combine in some way in this interferometer here. 1 is a herald. Okay, so to measure that 3 photon entanglement, they had to measure 4-fold coincidences, and that was a bit painful because they were getting 1 count per minute. Okay, so to those wanting to do quantum internet with these multi-photon sources, this is something to keep in mind. Okay, you really need to get high brightness in the sources. Otherwise, it will be painful. Okay, so how they certified the entanglement was by an entanglement witness. So you can again divide your high dimensional space into these different possibilities. So they tested an entanglement witness, which brings them somewhere here, which agrees with what they think their prepared state is. Then they did this. In the paper, they call it density matrix. And I will put estimated density matrix because when actually they did not do all the measurements to do quantum state tomography properly. Like they have some assumptions that, oh, the coincidences here will be here. With some knowledge of the state, of course you can do that, okay? But this is an estimated density matrix. They actually say in the paper, do you see where you have like crosses here? They actually didn't measure anything corresponding to that. So they just they put their measurements on density matrix plot and call that the density matrix. But I'll call it an estimated density matrix to be fair to all the people who do quantum state tomography. Okay? Okay, I think that's it. So for this one, we reviewed photonic QDIT. So I showed you how convenient it is to use transverse modes. I hope I convinced you that we violated the min entropy splitting inequality. Ignorance of the whole does not imply ignorance of the parts. I showed you self-guided tomography. If you're doing quantum state tomography in your system, please try it. It's very quick, especially if you have nearly pure states being produced. It's really very quick and very robust as well to noise. And then I showed you how you can do QDIT gates using multiplane light conversion. And I reviewed some photonic entanglement experiments. QDIT space is a big space. Like you just saw the map, the Lord of the Rings map, like the entanglement witnesses that you have to measure. I think photons are perfect for exploring this kind of Hilbert space because it really gives you a way to make pristine entangled states, right? There's a reason that Bell inequalities were measured using photons because they really give you very good entangled states because the world is cold for photons. Okay, that's it. Dinner time. Or unless you have questions, sorry. I'm skipping question time. Questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. It was really really cool talk overall. I've got a couple of questions. So you said that for the SLM sort of like mode converter, yeah, you needed 7. Was that just for a particular like order, or would that optimization change if you did it with like 7 or 13 or 11?
Regardless of the dimensionality that we're doing, we always use 7. That's just a choice for us because we want to, we just want to keep it the same for everything. So we just use 7. But the choice of 7 is trial and error.
And you said that experiment with fibers. What's the highest number of these like OAM modes that you can fit into a fiber?
Depends which fiber. So
Okay.
in Boston University, there is Siddharth Ramachandran's group who use a different kind of fiber, very good special fibers that can hold a lot of these. It can hold a lot of these vortex, OAM, LG kind of mode. So it depends on the fiber. Multimode fiber, I think you can, Mehul Malik's group in Scotland, I think they have up to maybe a few hundreds. Then, having said that, those are not nice modes. Like they are modes that so far, what I have shown you are really nice mathematical modes that I get from solving the wave equation. Okay? You get the fiber, you do SVD, you can get the modes that fiber supports. And that can be as many as 100, say, for example. But those are not nice modes in a way. Like if you look at it, it looks like speckle. You can do that too. Like no one's stopping you from doing that. It's just, these ones are just nicer. Yeah.
Yeah, Mehul's work's definitely very cool, but yeah, cool, thanks.
Yeah, I kinda gravitate to these modes because I do a lot of foundations and it's just nicer in talks to give modes that look like that. Questions? Dinner time? Okay, dinner time. Thank you.